Hey guys, I think this is the last time you ever have to see my face or hear me talk. It's our last lecture today. I'm sorry, I have a bit of a cold, so I'm sorry if I'm sniffly. Um, I would tell you guys that I tested negative, but you don't care. You're seeing me on here, so it doesn't matter. Anyway, we are finishing up today with media, power, and political communication. And then do not forget, I know a lot of you have emailed me, and I know folks are working on it. Your essay is due on Monday, the 29th. So it's been up. You guys have instructions. I posted some clarifying kind of formatting stuff. It's being copied and pasted into Blackboard though. So do not worry about, headers or formatting other than, I would like it to be 3 to 5 double spaced pages that you copy and paste into Blackboard. You're going to lose all your formatting. So I'm not going to be a stickler about any of that kind of stuff. I care about you answering the questions and you citing your work. That's really the most important stuff. All right, so we'll talk about media, power, and political communication today, which is what your essay is about. Your essay is due on Monday, the 29th. I also am going to post your final exam on Monday, the 29th, and it is due on December 6th because I've got to get grades in. It's kind of written a little bit differently on your syllabus, but it will be posted on Monday, and then you'll be done on December 6th because that's when, or before, if you get done early, that's when your final exam is due, and that'll be it for this class. Always reach out with any questions. I have said this before, but if you are missing any assignments, please email me, and we'll see about getting those made up. I don't want anybody to be missing anything because this is all online. I know it's a little trickier, so please reach out, and we'll make sure that everything's taken care of before the end of the semester. All right. So, media, power, and political communication. So what's at stake in living in an information bubble? That's kind of how your text starts. I think it's so funny all of their different ways of talking about it. They talk about, in 2016, there was a nightclub shooting, and there were two really different stories that emerged from that Pulse nightclub shooting. One said that there was a mentally disturbed shooter who was conflicted about his own sexuality, interviewed 3 times by the FBI for possible terrorist sympathies, and on the terror watch list, but able to be a licensed security guard and bought an assault rifle. Sorry, my brain is on cold medicine. Hillary Clinton was running for president at the time, and so was Donald Trump. Hillary really embraced the LGBT community and talked about an assault weapon ban. These themes were really repeated and woven into a common story that were shared like wildfire. The other story on the Trump end of the spectrum was that the shooting was conducted by a member of ISIS who is committed to exterminating gays. That the president at the time, President Obama, was complicit by not using the phrase radical Islamic terrorism and for suspected Muslim sympathies. The big question was, how did this guy get in the country and how can people like him be kept out? Trump did express sympathy for the LGBT community, but really reiterated his call for his ban on immigration from other countries where there was a perceived threat to Americans, which this story really resonated with his base and took on wings in social media. These two very different narratives that come from the same event. If you live in one world, you may not have even known the other narrative existed. We live in an information bubble, a closed loop of this self-reinforcing evidence supporting our particular interpretation of events. So the essential function of communications is to really record events and give meaning to them, to create a story or a narrative about how they fit into the past and stretch into the future. In the past, people did it with legends and myths, holy texts, fairy tales. We tell stories as humans. It gives us history and a way of passing down history to new generations. Part of politics is having your narrative accepted as the authoritative account. Storytellers of the past and power holders had this monopoly on control for much of human history because books were in scarce supply and a lot of people couldn't read anyway. So the gatekeepers were the journalists and the media elite who determined which news stories are covered and which are not. It's not like this quite so anymore. We live in the constant explosion of narratives from TV news to social media. Where do we get our information, though? Narratives are built from information, and we get that from a wide array of media sources. Media, you guys, if you have not picked up on this yet, this is important for your question, for your essay. Media is the plural of medium, an agency through which communication between two different entities take place. We think about a media sometimes as like someone who can transmit a message from the spiritual world to earthbound souls. But mass media conveys information cheaply and efficiently from the upper reaches of politics to everyday society. Mass media, of course, is the means of conveying information to a large public audience cheaply and efficiently. Today, we do more than just watch and listen to the media. We're more interactive in nature. Media convergence is the merging of traditional media with digital communication technologies such as telecommunications and the internet. Politicians really have to stay on top of electronic innovation that continually shapes and alters the political world. News used to enter an American's life at only a few neatly defined, very predictable points in the day. Your local morning paper was maybe read with your breakfast. The afternoon paper waited for you when you came home from work. There were big city papers, but they were expensive unless you lived in the big city. In the 1960s came evening news on all 3 television stations at 7:30. Walter Cronkite, he was the most trusted face in news. You guys, I was a broadcast journalism major, so I feel like I have stories on everything that we've talked about this semester, but we spent a lot of time in journalism school talking about all of this. Unless, you wanted to watch Walter Cronkite, but you only got to see him at 7:30 unless there was a special event, maybe the space shoot or a tragedy like JFK that required a special bulletin. Today, we get a little news from a lot of sources. Only about 20% of Americans get their news from newspapers now. How many people read newspapers? We actually get the Lexington Chronicle? Anyway, whatever it is, and it comes once a week. My 5-year-old loves it. He loves to flip through the sports section, and he's like, "Mama, can we get the paper every day?" I'm like, nobody really reads the newspaper anymore, but my 5-year-old does. We get it a little bit from the radio and news and websites and apps, network news, cable. A lot of people get it from social media. Of course, Facebook being the most popular still. Millennials are more likely to rely on Facebook than their elders, of course. Baby boomers rely on local television. Your grandparents, you probably go and they've got the local TV on, right? Gen Xers kind of split the difference. The younger generations are more likely to get their news from sources they curate themselves. You kind of choose what your source of news is going to be. I have on my phone a million different apps because I do work in this world. And so I want to know what everybody is saying about all the news. I don't want just one perspective, but I get push notifications from everybody on what's happening in the news. Most people probably maybe only have one of those. Older people kind of just serve up to watch whatever is served up to them, whatever their local TV station that they loved forever is what they're going to be watching. We are probably exposed to a lot of news, but our levels of information are not high. Younger people have a harder time answering questions about domestic policies and public figures than older people. Though we have a lot of sources, we're maybe not paying as much of attention. Print media is in deep trouble. In 1941, a third of Americans bought a daily paper. In 2009, only 13% of Americans did. 2015 was the worst year for print media since the Great Recession, and it's probably gotten worse since then. Many papers have ceased publication or moved to a print-only hybrid or simply an online existence. Most towns have only one paper if they have one at all. Like I said, the Lexington paper comes once a week. It probably always has, though, because we have the state not too far away. Journalism has traditionally been paid for by newspapers that either have their own news bureaus around the world or are supported by news services like the Associated Press, the AP. They pay for these sources and have no other way to reach out to their market. We don't really know what journalism is going to look like in a new post-newspaper age. Maybe more podcasts. Radios are really commonplace. We have they used to be once state of the art. Now we have at least one, right? 90% of people say they listen to the radio weekly. In the 1980s, we had talk radio introduced. There were some non-commercial networks like NPR. The impact of radio, though, can't really compare with the effects of television. Live television viewership has declined, but we have other means now. DVR, stream from internet. Nielsen, the marketing firm that tracks how many people watch things, say we spend 6 to 8 hours a day at school or at work, and we watch 5 hours a day of television. That's a lot of our day. That's a lot of how we're spending our leisure time. TV is primarily for entertainment, and news has always been secondary. So now there's this infotainment or news shows dressed up with drama and emotion to entice viewers to tune in. We used to have 3 stations. Now there's 189, I think, probably more. Of course there's more, but That's the average, is about 189. We only watch about 17 of them. And honestly, if you have to think about it, you probably don't even watch that many of them. So they focus on specific audiences, narrowcasting, the targeting of specialized audiences by the media. JFK was the first politician to really make good use of television. It was almost like it was designed for this young photogenic president. But the TV brought the country together in a community of grief when he was assassinated. Cable stations and C-SPAN offer news around the clock, but not all of the news concerns politics. The reach of print media, radio, and TV is really dwarfed by the scope and possibilities of the internet, though. In 2015, 85% of Americans use the internet. 70% have broadband access at home. You guys, we passed a massive infrastructure bill in Congress last week, and the president signed it into law last Monday. It has a lot of provisions in there for broadband access, and so they're really trying to expand that access even past the 70%. So that number is going to go way up. A lot of people have access to internet from their smartphones and other devices, and the internet has really revolutionized the way we get information. It's made politics immediate and personal. For most of history, we haven't known our fellow citizens outside of our own communities, and we've been unable to directly investigate the issues ourselves. So we only know what the media has told us. We're still dependent on the mass media to connect us to the government and create the only real space we have for the public deliberation of issues. But technological developments make possible ever newer forms of political community and more immediate access to information. We have government officials who communicate with us directly, and they bypass the traditional press now. News organizations are businesses, occasionally nonprofits, they're devoted to reporting and disseminating news via print, broadcast, or digital media or multimedia combination. Most of them are multimedia ventures. They all have websites where most of the news in their print version can be found, often have additional content, blogs, podcasts. Access is sometimes free, but it provides a disincentive for people to subscribe and damages the news organization's bottom line. So they're putting things behind a paywall a lot of times now. As they're trying to find a viable model that keeps them solvent. News aggregators are websites, applications, and software that cull content from other sources. This is like Google News, HuffPost, BuzzFeed, The Skim. They choose articles from other sites to share with their readers, sometimes with some of their original content, and some allow readers to customize their own feeds. These are overlapping sources that give us access to more information than ever before. But the task of sorting and evaluating that information is our own responsibility. The web provides the information, but it's interactive to a degree that surpasses talk radio, television. And so political campaigns have started taking advantage of this. In 2008, Obama used really skillful social media, he used social media skillfully and was able to raise funds, organize, and get out the vote. The internet really has the potential to increase participation in politics. No one is going to replace no one experiment is going to replace what we're losing with the demise of news on paper. But over time, maybe there are new things that do give us the journalism we need. Or maybe not. I don't know. It's tricky, especially as a journalism major. It's something I think about a lot. So how does media ownership affect control of the narrative? Who owns the media? They're these big businesses, but they're on a scale undreamed of by such early journalism entrepreneurs like Joseph Pulitzer and William Hearst, who really had fiercely competitive tabloid wars in the 1890s that gave birth to what is known as yellow journalism, and they each rushed to attract readers with sensational headlines and stories. Our mainstream media today, a single figure doesn't dominate a paper or station's editorial policy, and it's no longer found only in the original print or broadcast form. All are owned by major conglomerates and have huge digital presences. There are 6 corporations: Time Warner, which merged with AT&T, Disney, Viacom, CBS Corporation, News Limited Corporation, and Comcast. They own most of our newspapers, magazines, TV news, publishing houses, movie studios, telephone companies, entertainment firms. I mean, everything. You probably recognize some of their names. So their editorial decisions are matters of corporate policy, not individual judgment, and their profit is gospel. Startups tend to be gobbled up by other outlets. Journalists who began as bloggers become the bigger part of the multimedia picture. So how does this media ownership impact the news we get? We should be aware of at least 5 major consequences. commercial bias, which is the tendency of the media to make coverage and programmatic decisions based on what will attract a large audience and maximize profits. People tune in to watch scandals, disasters, etc., so they're covered a lot. Second, the effort to get and keep large audiences and to make way for the increased advertising, which gets a reduced emphasis on political news, especially at the local level where older Americans get their news. And then third, the content of the news we get is lightened up, dramatized, streamlined to keep audiences tuned in. They specialize in infotainment, news dressed up to be engaging. Clickbait, sensational headlines designed to tempt internet users to click through to a specific website. Corporate ownership of today's media means that media outlets frequently face conflicts of interest in deciding what news to cover or how to cover it. 33% of newspaper editors say they wouldn't feel free to publish news that might harm their parent company. That should make us question what's being left out of the news we're receiving. And then breaking a news story has always been a point of pride for editors and journalists, but journalists have to walk this fine line between the time spent reporting and getting those stories published before the competition does. And this tension becomes even more intense as the daily deadlines for print or nightly broadcast have given way to the modern 24-hour news cycle. So many want to avoid getting scooped so much that they sometimes jump the gun and disseminate incorrect information or flat out lies. The corporate media conglomerations don't define all of our alternatives for getting the news. The explosion of online publishing gives people more alternatives for getting and sharing information that's not subject to a corporate agenda. Countries like the United Kingdom demonstrate that government-owned sources like the BBC can be bastions of creativity and innovation, and they can be well-respected gatekeepers. But almost all media is privately owned, but they don't operate without some public control. In the early days of radio, there was a great public enthusiasm for this new medium, so it resulted in so many stations that there was signal interference, and it threatened to damage the whole industry. So they had to kind of figure that out. They had 3 provisions to ensure fairness of having your view heard on the radio. First is the equal time rule. If one candidate speaks, all has to have the opportunity. Second is the fairness doctrine, requiring stations to give free airtime to issues of public concern. Third is the right of rebuttal, allowing people whose reputations were damaged on the air to respond. They've all been eliminated since, but they remain controversial. Politicians want rules enforced because they help them air their views publicly. Media owners see these rules as forcing them to air unpopular speakers who damage their ratings as their ability to decide station policy. A lot of these limitations were abolished in 1996, and it's opened up way for ownership of cable stations by network owners and allows cable companies to offer a lot of services previously only supplied by telephone companies, and so it's increased the possibility for a media monopoly. Who are the journalists? They're the gatekeepers who decide what news gets covered, and how. Corporate ownership doesn't tell the whole story of modern journalism. The mass media is no longer primarily owned by individuals, and much of digital media is filtered through news aggregators that simply link to the reporting of others. But there's individual journalists that continue to be the eyes and ears, nose and legs of the business. They discover, report, edit, and publish the news in newspapers and magazines, on radio, on television, and the internet. They play 4 roles in the modern media, which often coexist in one single journalist. They're gatekeepers. They decide details about what news gets covered or not, and not all journalists share this power equally. They're disseminators. They confine their role to getting the facts of the story straight and moving the news out to the public quickly, avoiding stories with unverified content, and reaching as wide an audience as possible. They're open to the criticism that in a complex society, simple dissemination does nothing to help the citizens interpret the news. They're interpreters and investigators. They develop their role in this reaction to the criticism and the growing sophistication of the issues confronting the American people. They're investigative reporters, journalists who research and verify the truth of political or corporate narratives and claims. Much like muckrakers in the early 20th century who exposed social ills like child labor laws, and latter-day reporters like Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein who exposed the Watergate cover-up. And then fourth, journalists are public mobilizers. They develop the cultural and intellectual interests of the public. They set the political agenda. They let people express their views, and they're closely aligned with contemporary movement called civic journalism, which is a movement among journalists to be responsive to citizen input in determining what news stories to cover. With the growing presence of the internet as a space where people can communicate and organize, public mobilization is becoming more of a grassroots affair. Who chooses journalism? Journalists are more overwhelmingly white and male. They are typically a little bit more liberal. Their values, they try to leave their values outside the newsroom and do objective work, but that's a difficult thing to do. Studies say there is no discernible bias in the media. I feel like that is not true at all. But of course, there are special news stations that serve one particular side or the other. Think of the narrative. So when we're spinning a political narrative, how do we start doing that? Think of the narrative that Northerners tell of the Civil War versus what we as Southerners tell of the Civil War. Was it a war to end slavery and restore national unity, or a war of succession because states' rights were violated? Same war, different narrative. When Walter Cronkite visited Vietnam in 1968 and said we were losing the war, LBJ knew he'd lost support from the country because of how trusted Walter Cronkite was. Today, there's really no consensus on who the trusted reporter of facts is. We have a lot of different media personalities that we look to. We'd like to think that journalism and news gathering is all about facts, and I guess in its purest sense it is. But if it isn't true, it isn't a fact, right? Control of the facts itself can confer power, and discovering and reporting facts in a timely way is power. What we think of the job of news media is a powerful part of democratic society. Without the facts, we can't make the good informed decisions about our government that we need to make. The control of the facts, though, can be directed toward goals other than the health of the democracy. Withholding information or releasing information at a strategic time, or refusing to invest resources in uncovering all the facts, these are all powerful actions that don't lead to good informed decision making. The facts themselves, though, don't always tell us all we need to know. They often need to be put into context and interpreted to know what to make of them, and that's when they become part of a narrative, a story with meaning and value. The revolving door, we've talked about the revolving door with lobbyists before, but the same thing in journalism. It's the tendency of public officials, journalists, and lobbyists to move between public and private sector jobs. Journalists take positions in the government and then return to journalism again, and vice versa. The role of the pundit. So a pundit is a professional observer and commentator on politics. It's traditionally someone with a lot of wisdom, someone who is skilled in the ways of media and politics, who can make good observations and predictions about the political world and help us untangle the complicated implications of political events. You guys, I think I've mentioned before, if you're on Instagram, follow Sharon Says So. She is fantastic at this. She's very unbiased and does a great job of interpreting the news and explaining kind of what's going on in like layman's terms. She's fantastic. But she's not on TV. She's on Instagram. But a 24-hour news cycle means they need to fill bodies. They need bodies to fill panels. Some pundits become celebrity journalists at this point. They cross over from being reporting to becoming the public figure themselves. Because they receive widespread media coverage, pronouncement of a pundit carries a lot of power. There are several types of media-related effects on our thinking. Agenda setting, the media's role in defining the relative importance of an issue or event via the amount of prominence of coverage they devote to it. When a TV reporter chooses to cover an event, they're telling us this is important and we should pay attention. This gives national storytellers a lot of power. The internet dilutes it a little bit. Framing. This is the process through which the media emphasizes particular aspects of the news story, thereby influencing the public's perception of the story. Just as a painting's appearance can be altered by its frame, a political event can look different to us depending on how the media frames it, what they choose to emphasize in their coverage. Framing may affect how the public perceives that issue, whether they see it as a problem, and who they view it responsible for solving it. Third is the persuasion by a professional communicator. Some say the media affects public opinion because viewers who don't often have the time or background to research an issue themselves relies on an opinion leader. But often, especially with the internet and 24-hour news, the communicators on whom the media rely are people who regularly pass through the revolving door and whose objectivity can't be taken for granted. Fourth is the reduction of politics to sound and fury. Reporting on the details of policy wonks is hard and requires diligence and toughness. Being under pressure to constantly produce something that people will tune into or click on means a lot of what's being reported is shallow and meaningless unless a reporter can peg it to a quick and dirty narrative. Horse race journalism. The media, I've talked about this before, the media's focus on the competitive aspects of politics rather than on the actual policy proposals and the political decisions. But let's face it, you're more interested in who's winning than like what the actual politics are, right? Viewing politics as a competition between individuals rather than policy differences is more interesting to a lot of people. But it can, excuse me, increase cynicism and trivializes what's at stake in campaigns or battles in Congress, and it doesn't educate the American public. Optics are the way a situation, a person, or event is presented by the media and perceived by the public. The TV focuses on giving us pictures of politics instead of really delving beneath the surface. So the focus becomes on optics and more superficial aspects of politics. Soundbite, of course, is a brief, snappy excerpt from a public figure's speech that's easy to repeat on the news. It's the audio equivalent of a snapshot. We have no attention span, and so we want this instant and speedy gratification. So reporters really tend to concentrate on developing a simplified narrative. Feeding frenzy is the excessive press coverage of an embarrassing or scandalous subject. Its obsession with catching a political official in a lie or a gaffe means that politicians are treated as fundamentally untrustworthy, though most do precisely what they say they're going to do. In fact, I've been in this world for so long, I can tell you a lot of times what they're going to do before they do it. That's a lot of my job as a lobbyist, is to do that. The power of mainstream media's narrative is selective perception, the phenomenon of filtering incoming information through personal values and interests. If people don't seem to be well informed on the issues emphasized by the media, they may not see them as playing a role in a narrative they value or having an effect on their lives, which leads to cynicism about the media. About half or maybe more of the American public thinks the news is too biased, sensationalized, manipulated by their own special interests. Reporters offer too many of their own opinions and they're negative. If people cease to trust the media becomes less effective in playing their legitimate roles as the more controversial ones, and democracy becomes more difficult to sustain. There's no doubt the media portrays politics in a negative light, and that news reporting emphasizes personality, superficial image, and conflict over substantive policy issues. Is this the media's fault, or is this the responsibility of politicians and their own press officers who are so obsessed with their images on TV that they limit the access to media? They speak only in prearranged sound bites and present carefully orchestrated media events. In their own effort to control the political narrative, politicians are limiting the ability of journalists to do their job properly. The effort to control the media can lead to an emphasis on short-term gain over long-term priorities, making the policy decisions with an eye to their political impact known as what's called the permanent campaign, which is the idea that governing requires a continual effort to convince the public to sign on to the program, requiring a reliance on consultants and an emphasis of politics over policy. The chief mechanism of a permanent campaign is news management, which is effort of a politician's staff to control the news about the politician. They want to put the politician in the best possible light. They want the right spin, the spin being the interpretation of a politician's words or actions designed to present a favorable image. For example, Richard Nixon he had his image rehabbed after he lost to the media-savvy JFK. JFK's image as a war hero, a patriot, a devoted father, and faithful husband, no, all those things obviously weren't true, but that's what they depicted him as, learned that the response to this image is not the man, since most voters have no contact with the man. So Nixon was repackaged and sold as the new Nixon, and he won the election and re-election when he had to resign, which may have been the inevitable revelation of the real Nixon underneath. Some of the techniques that they used on Nixon campaign have become part of the basic repertoire of political staffs. They can include tight control of information. They maybe pick a line of the day and orchestrating everything they do around that line of the day. They have tight control of access to the politician. If the politician's only available to the press for a certain amount of time, they're forced to report the appearance as the only available news. They make a concerted effort to avoid the White House press corps. That meant Nixon would win a lot of times to regional papers that were a little easier to manipulate. Today, this includes TV talk shows, late night TV, and other forms that go directly to the public. Part of this is also for rewarding media outlets that provide friendly coverage and punishing those that do not. They also prepackage news in sound bites. If the media is only going to allow the public a brief snippet of political language, let the politician staff decide what that will be. And then they have something called leaks, which is the confidential information that's secretly revealed to the press. It can serve as what's called a trial balloon, which is an unofficial leak of a proposal to determine public reaction to it without risk. If the reaction is negative, the official denies he ever mentioned it. If it's positive, the policy can go ahead without the risk. Not all presidential administrations have been equally as accomplished at using those techniques as Nixon was. Reagan actually was referred to as the model of public relations. Clinton did not manage the media effective early. By his second term, they were doing a little better at handling his scandals. George W. Bush did a really good job of news management. He always received questions only from those who endorsed his programs and goals. His reporters that he trusted were favored in White House briefings. Obama was not quite as disciplined as George W. Bush. Obviously, President Trump did not begin on good footing with the press and has made a target of them in his campaigns. And Joe Biden, I think, the book doesn't talk about it, but I really think his kind of strategy is avoiding the press, honestly. He wants to be as quiet and out of the spotlight as possible. Everybody has their own strategies. Politicians have to spend time and energy on image considerations, but that doesn't help them serve the public. But the skills required by an actor and a statesman are not the same. There is a transformation of politics into professional storytelling, which means sometimes we lose political accountability, the democratic principle that political leaders must answer to the public for their actions. This is the hallmark of our democracy. If our leaders do something we don't like, we can make them bear the consequences of their actions by voting them out of office. Almost from the beginning, the control of the American media has been in the hands of an elite group: party leaders, politicians, wealthy entrepreneurs, corporate owners. But now we have more of a citizen role than we ever had in the past. In the past, we have had roles such as reader, listener, and watcher, but now there's this rapid changes in information technology that offers the hope that media can serve the public interest more effectively. Citizen journalism is reporting and commentary by the everyday citizen, unaffiliated with traditional media outlets and distributed via the web in the form of blogs or podcasts or video uploads. They're the modern day equivalent of giving a citizen their own printing press and the means to publish their own views. But it's an unregulated media. We're not going to be credentialed to come into a White House press by just having a blog. We still need to scrutinize the reporting of citizens as we do the rest of media, but there's no substitute for a critical evaluation of the news. Citizen journalism, though, provides a new kind of content that is truly independent, open, and democratic in a way that traditional media news sources could never be. All right, guys, thanks for hanging in there with me this semester. Please email me if you have any questions. Don't forget your essay is due on Monday, the 29th, and your final exam will be posted that day when they do on the 6th. Thanks so much. Have a great week.